Hello everyone and welcome to our first video lesson for geometry with Miss Cornelia. Today we're beginning with our first unit entitled Foundations for Geometry, and our first section is called Learning the Language. Typically when people think of geometry, they typically think of shapes, but a really big part of geometry is actually the vocabulary. So we're going to spend a lot of time looking at vocabulary words this semester especially, but throughout the whole year. And we're going to have a lot of those vocabulary words in today's lesson. So let's get started. Our first thing we want to look at here is we have this chart. We have the term and definition. We're going to have how we name it, and then we're going to have an example. I'm actually going to go a little out of order here. We're going to start with the term, draw an example, and then we're going to talk about how we name it. All right, so our first vocabulary word is point. A point names a position or location and has no size or dimension. So a point, as you've typically seen before, is represented by a dot, like so. So we have our dot, and how we name that dot is with a capital letter. So I'm going to put that in the how we name box, a capital letter. And then I'm going to draw a capital letter on my point. For our example, it doesn't really matter which letter you choose. I'm just going to pick the letter K because that's the first letter in my last name. All right. Next, we have a line. A line is a straight path made up of infinitely many points that extends in two opposite directions. Okay, so you've probably seen a line before. Typically, we see them looking like this. In geometry, if we're drawing a line, we want to make sure that we have an arrow on both sides because lines do extend in either direction forever, and that arrow lets me know that this keeps going. On a line, we typically will have a few points highlighted, but each individual spot is also a point. We're going to put a couple on here to highlight our points, and I'm going to name those points A and B. All right, so I have point A and point B on the line. How we name the line. There's two options for this. The first option is with the points that are on the line, so you would pick two of them. So you would have 2 points on the line. In the example I have drawn here, we would write that as A, B, right next to each other, and then you draw a representation of the line above the two letters. So I have a bar with an arrow on either end. And it is very important that you get the arrows on that bar. If you don't have the arrows on the bar, then you're actually calling it something else. So make sure that if it's a line, you have the two arrows on both ends. All right, so what if you don't have any points highlighted? Well, then you have the other option for naming a line, and that would be our or here, or you're going to use a lowercase letter. So capital letters are for points, lowercase letters are for lines, and we're going to put a lowercase letter on this line for our example. Let's go with the letter J. So I have the letter J there. So if I'm going to name it using this lowercase letter that I just named my line with, then I actually have to write out the word line as well. So I end up with line J, and that is how you name a line. All right, next we have a plane. A plane is a flat surface made up of infinitely many points that extends in all directions, and it has no thickness. So a good example of how you typically would see a plane represented is with a piece of paper. So you get this paper and it has no thickness to it. There's nothing to it. It's just a rectangle. The difference between that piece of paper and a full plane is that the plane continues forever and that paper is cut off on the edges. So when we're drawing a picture of a plane, I'm actually going to go ahead and draw a rectangle but there's going to be one difference here, and that difference is that I'm going to add an arrow extending off of all sides of the rectangle to represent that this is a plane. Alright, so now that I have that plane, I said that it was made up of infinitely many points. So within this plane, there's a whole bunch of points. You can't see them. We're going to highlight a few. Let's put 3 on here. We're going to call this C. We're going to call this D. We're going to call this E. So I have points C, D, and E in there. And we are highlighting those points for a reason here. One of the ways, again, 2 ways for a plane, for naming a plane, one of the ways to name a plane is to use 3 points that are not on the same line. So we have 3 points not on a line. So if I were to use the points that I just pointed out here, all you're going to do is you're going to take the points and you're going to put them next to each other with no things added to it. So we have C, D, E. Just like this. It reads plane C, D, E. I don't put a bar above it. I don't draw a picture of a plane. I just leave the letters as is. The other option, so we have 3 points not on a line, or to name a plane, you can use a script capital letter. So you might be wondering what a script capital letter is. The best way I can think of to kind of explain what a script letter is thinking like cursive letters. They're a little more fancy. Script letters are often used for other purposes in math itself, so I don't use them for naming planes all that often, but you might see it sometimes. So an example of what that might look like is if you were to draw a fancy looking capital R, like so, then if we were to name it using that script capital letter, we would actually have to write the word plane out again. So I have plane R. Alright, so those are our first 3 vocabulary words. Our next vocabulary words all have prefixes on them, so we're going to take a minute here and let's brainstorm. What does the prefix co mean, as in coworker, collaborate, co-pay, or co-owner? Co in all of these words might make you think together, with, jointly, and I'm going to go ahead and say together. The prefix co makes me think together. So something with co, together. What does the prefix non mean, as in non-existent, non-verbal, non-fiction? Well, there's a couple things that you might come up with, but I think the most common is going to be the word not. So we have co, together, non, not. So we have 4 vocabulary words that start with co or non, and we have, to start with, collinear points. Co means together. The word line is in the name. So collinear means that it is points that are on the same line. Collinear points are points that lie on the same line. Next we have non-collinear points. Non means not. Collinear means on the same line. So we have not on the same line. So non-collinear points are points that do not lie on the same line. So think about if you were to draw 3 points like I did in the plane. We'll bring that back down here a second. These points are non-collinear. They're not on the same line. There's no line that I can draw through 2 of the points and get that 3rd point on it. Alright, next we have coplanar points. Co means together. We have the word plane in there, so we're with the plane, and we're points. So points that lie on the same plane. So those points that we were just pointing at in the plane were non-collinear, but they were coplanar because they were on the same plane. Next we have non-coplanar points. Not together, on the plane. So we have points that do not lie on the same plane. So if we were to add a point to the outside of our plane, let's say we just have this point A floating out here, this point is non-coplanar with points C, D, and E because it is not on the same plane. We'll take that out of there now. We don't really want to leave that in there. Alright, so now we've gotten a good amount of our vocabulary words. We're going to go ahead and turn to the next page where we will get a few more. Alright, before we begin going through some more vocabulary, we're going to take a second to see if we can figure out how to solve these problems using the information that we just got. So let's zoom in here a second. It says use the figure below to answer these questions. Alright, so name 3 non-collinear points. Okay, non-collinear means that they are not on the same line. 2 of them can be on the same line, but that third one is not going to be on the same line. So if I'm looking at this picture here, I notice that I have R, X, and Q on the same line. So I'm just going to go from left to right. I have R, X, and then I have this point Z that's not on the line. So I have to use Z. So I'm going to go R, X, Z. And those are my non-collinear points. Next we have named 3 collinear points. Collinear means that they're on the same line. We have 3 points on this line, so I have to use all 3 of them. There's no other option. So I'm going to go ahead and write those points out. I have point R, point X, and point Q. Alright, now it says to name a line. Thinking back to the second vocabulary word we had today, a line is named using 2 points on the line or a lowercase letter. I don't see any lowercase letters near this line, so I'm going to go ahead and use 2 points on the line. It doesn't matter which points you use, just as long as they're on the line. So I'm going to pick R and Q. So I have line RQ. Now remember, you can't just leave it blank like this. You have to put that image of a line above it, and the bar has to have the arrows. So I have this bar with an arrow on each end, which now reads line RQ. Right, now it says to name the plane. As I'm looking at this image, I again don't have a script capital letter, so I have to use my other option, which is to use 3 points that are not on the same line, or as we just learned, those are called non-collinear. So I'm going to take my non-collinear points that I used before, and I'm going to put them right next to each other, and that's how I name a plane. So I have R, X, Z. The points are right next to each other. I don't put any line above it. I don't box them. Just the 3 points right next to each other. So I have plane R, X, Z. Alright. So now that we've done an example and we've used some of our vocabulary words, we're going to go ahead and learn a few more. Alright. This time we've got 4 in this table, and we're going to go ahead and follow the same pattern from before, where we start with the term, then we're going to draw our picture, and then we will go ahead and name it. Alright, our first vocabulary word here is a segment, which is the part of a line with 2 endpoints and has a definite length. Alright, so it says it's the part of a line. So in my example, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a line. So I have this line here, and I know that lines have points on them, and I'm going to use the point F, and let's use the point G. Alright, so I have the part of a line with 2 endpoints. So a segment is actually this chunk in the line between the 2 points. So our segment is from here to there, from point F to point G. That is our segment. That line segment, for the purpose of our example here, I'm actually going to pull out the line and I'm just going to connect the 2 points with that bar to show that this is a segment. This would be on the line, but the segment itself looks like this. So now that I have my segment drawn and I've given it its endpoints and name, we're going to go ahead and name the segment. When you name a segment, you actually have to use the names of the endpoints. So how we name it, we're just going to write the 2 endpoints. And what that looks like is if we take those 2 letters and we put them right next to each other, and then we draw a bar above them. This time, it's just the bar. So if it's just a bar, this reads as segment FG. If you put the arrows on it, it says line FG. No arrows means segment. All right. Next we have array. Array is the part of a line that stands at an endpoint and extends forever in one direction. So if we are to draw a ray, again it's a part of a line, but note that it starts at an endpoint. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start by drawing an endpoint here. And then I'm going to draw an arrow pointing off in one direction. And that arrow is the ray in of itself. It starts at the endpoint and it continues forever. I'm going to go ahead and name my endpoint. Let's name it N. And I'm going to put another point on the ray and I'm going to call that M. So I have N and M. How do we name the ray? When you are naming the ray, you have to use the one endpoint. So we're going to start with that part. So we use the endpoint and any other point on that ray. So in our example, I have the point N as the endpoint. I have to use N. And then I have this other point M that I can use. If there was another point on here, I could use whichever one I so choose to pick. But because I only have N and M, I have to use those 2 points. So I'm going to go ahead and start by writing my point names next to each other. So I have N, M. Now, in our notation, what notes that this is a ray is again to draw an image of that ray above it. However, the endpoint N has to be a blank side, and there will be an arrow pointing towards the other letter. So on NM, I'm going to draw a bar. N is the endpoint, so that side is blank. M is what N is pointing towards, so that is where the arrow goes. This reads ray NM. If it didn't have any arrows, it'd be a segment. If it had 2 arrows, it would be a line. 1 arrow, it's a ray. All right. Next, we have opposite rays. So opposite rays are 2 rays that share a common endpoint and extend forever in opposite directions. So let's go ahead and draw a picture of that. I have one ray that is pointing to the right, and I have another ray that is pointing to the left. And this ray, those 2 rays, share this endpoint that's right in the middle. And that endpoint, we're going to go ahead and call that point T. So I have point T in the middle. And then I'm going to go ahead and put a couple other points on our rays. I'm going to put a point on this ray. I'm going to call that point, we'll call that U. And I have the point on this other ray that I'm going to call A. So I have A on our left ray, U on our right ray. and together they are opposite rays. Now at this point you might be looking at that and thinking, this looks like a line. And you'd be right. Opposite rays form a line. We specifically call them opposite rays when we're trying to note that we have two specific things that we're pointing out at coming from this one center point. And we'll get to that a little bit more in a later video down the road, but for now you just need to recognize that a line is also a set of opposite rays. Alright, so how do we name that set of opposite rays? We name it using the points on the rays, and we actually are naming both rays. So we have this ray, and we're naming both of them. So in our how we name it box, we're going to go ahead and write the common endpoint, and any other point on each ray. So let's go ahead and start with this ray here. I have T to A, so I have the point TA, where T is my endpoint. So on the bar above, T will be blank and the A side will have an arrow. And then I have a second one, so I have and ray starting from T going to U, so I have ray TU, where T gets a blank bar side and U gets the arrow. So this reads as ray TA and ray TU. I know that those are opposite rays because they both have the same endpoint though. So I can read that as opposite rays TA and TU. Alright, our last vocabulary word for this section, and I know there was a lot of them, and this is our last one. We have an intersection. An intersection is a point or points that two or more figures have in common. So you might be thinking, okay, well, if two lines were to cross, they'd have one intersection point. And you would be correct. So if I crossed these two lines, there's this point in the middle that they cross at. But when would you have more than one point at an intersection? Well, what if you had a rectangle that was overlapped by a circle in the corner? Well, now there's two intersection points. Your intersection could also be a line itself. If you had two rays that intersected, they would form a line. But we're going to go ahead and stick with our point examples for this lesson. So I'm going to highlight these points of intersection, and let's label them as A, and then we have B and C. So if we wanted to name these intersections, you actually just use the point or the line that is the intersection. So in our how we name it box, we would say we name it using the point or points or the line of intersection. Alright, so in our example here, what that would look like is simply just writing the point out. Point A is the intersection, or we would say B and C, because both of them are intersection points. Alright, now we're going to go ahead and apply the vocabulary words that we just learned in the second half of this lesson. So we're going to use this figure right here to answer these three questions. One, name two planes that intersect at segment CQ. As I'm looking at the image, I'm noticing that C is on the upper right corner and Q is right below that. So I'm looking for the two sides that share this edge of CQ. I'm noticing that the front uses that edge, and so does the back side. So I'm going to go ahead and outline those two sides here a second. And if I'm naming those two planes, the only thing I need to use is the 3 points that aren't on the same line. Now, if you're looking at that, you might notice that the only points that they give you are the ones that come to a point. So if you pick any 3 of them, it's going to work out because they're not on the same line. So I have, in the front, let's use C, Q, R. So plane C, Q, R. And my second plane, I'm just going to go ahead and use C and Q again because they're shared. I have B, C, Q. So I have plane CQR and plane BCQ. Alright, now we want to name the intersection of planes APB and BCD. So I'm noticing that A, P, and B are on this back face here, and BCD are on the top of the shape here. Let's go ahead and outline those two shapes as well. So now we have those two figures pointed out, and we want to name the intersection of those planes. As I'm looking at these planes, I'm noticing that they don't just share one point, they share this whole edge. So this segment here, segment AB, is the intersection of planes APB and BCD. So let's go ahead and write that out. I have segment AB. To note that it's a segment, I have to draw that bar on the top that says segment AB. Alright, next we have name the intersection of line segments RQ and RO. So as I'm looking at the figure here, I have R in this corner and RQ and RO. What I'm noticing is that the shared point R is not only on the shape, but it's also in the names of the segments that we're trying to find the intersection of. But we already know from the names and from the image we were looking at just a moment ago that point R is our common figure. Sorry, our common intersection. That is the intersection of segment RO and segment RQ. Before we conclude our lesson, we're going to go ahead and flip to the next page where we're going to get a little bit of a preview of some of the things to come. A postulate is something accepted as true without really being able to prove it. The 5 postulates we'll be looking at today will pretty much be referencing in the next few days. But when we get to our proofs unit, these postulates will come back and we'll be using them quite frequently. But for now, we're just going to take a look at what they are. So we have postulate number 1 here that says through any 2 points there is exactly one line. And we have our 2 points and there's a line connecting them. Postulate number 2, through any 3 non-collinear points there is exactly one plane containing them. We have our plane containing 3 points and they're not on a line. Postulate 3 says if 2 points lie in a plane, then the line containing those points lies on the plane. So we have 2 points inside the plane and there's this line that is on our plane there. Number 4, if 2 lines intersect, they intersect in exactly one point. So we have 2 lines drawn here and their intersection point is highlighted there. Number 5, if 2 planes intersect, they intersect in exactly one line. So I have this one plane that's going up and down and this second plane that's going from side to side, and they are intersecting on this line right there. Alright, that is where we're going to end our first video lesson. We'll pick back up in video number 2 with our second section covering segments and angles.